If you're a domino artist, these 10 safety gap hacks will be a lifesaver. What's up, Domino community? Today I'm going to be sharing a bunch of tips and tricks for making safety gaps and how you can step up your game to make safety gaps even more efficient and to save your projects in many more ways. So if you're unfamiliar with a safety gap, real quick, I'll just explain. You make a gap by taking out about 5 or 6 dominoes in a row, and then when you knock down the setup by accident, it won't knock down the entire thing. Instead, it'll just knock down a section of your build. But there are a couple of ways that you can approach making safety gaps that will make it a little bit more safe and prevent more failures. So I'm going to go through that more in detail and very excited to share some of my tips. My first tip when it comes to safety gaps is, when in doubt, take out more dominoes than you think you need to make a larger gap, just in case the dominoes slide out. I know some people have like a set number of dominoes that they use, like they take out 5 dominoes and make a gap, or 6 dominoes. It really depends on your floor surface and the dominoes that you're using, because some dominoes are going to slide much further than others depending on if it's really slippery or if the texture of the surface is more grippy. So if you're unsure, take out more dominoes than you think you need and do some tests prior to making a safety gap to see like how far the domino will actually slide on that surface that you're building on. Number 2, make the safety gap on a corner. So instead of taking out dominoes in a straight line, see where the dominoes curve and take out dominoes like this. And now this is guaranteed that your domino will not hit the next line by accident because it's in a completely different direction. For example, if I take out the curve like this and I knock it down by accident, oh, it's like not gonna slide and hit it because the dominoes aren't in front of the other domino. And it's actually easier to fill in a gap when it's on the corner, because if your hand is on the outside of the line like this and you're filling in a curve like here, you'll see that there's a larger gap on the outside, which allows you more room for your hand to like hold the domino, if that makes sense. So like, don't fill in the domino on this side, fill it in on the wide part of the curve. Number 3, when you're filling in the safety gaps, it can sometimes be helpful to fill in the dominoes that are closest to the direction of the topple last. Now, let me give you an example of this. Let's say we have this setup here. It's gonna start with the green domino and knock down this way and end with this triangle. Now, I could start setting up the domino next to this orange domino, but this is in the direction of the topple. So if I were to knock down this pink domino by accident, it would knock down the rest of the setup in the right direction. I kind of like to see it as like, there's more risk involved if you're setting up the dominoes in the same direction of the topple, because this is like 5 dominoes of like high risk where I can knock it down. But if I start building the safety gap over here where there's still a gap, like in between the setup where it's supposed to be toppling in the right direction, it feels like there's less pressure, because if I knock it down, it goes backwards, but I can still catch it if I were to knock it down the opposite direction, and it might not topple everything if it topples backwards. Number 4, instead of taking out regular dominoes, you could also make a safety gap by taking out other things. Like, for example, you could take out these field starters or small to large dominoes before it hits a structure. That creates a gap. If you have a marble on a track, you could take off the marble and that would be like your safety gap. There are a variety of ways that you can actually make a gap. It's not necessarily just with dominoes. And it worked. Number 5, you can put something next to the gap to remind you that you made a gap and that you need to fill it in before you knock it down. I got so many comments on my last video where people were like, I forgot to fill in a safety gap. And I hear you, I have done that 10 million times and it is the most silly mistake that you feel so silly after you forget to fill in a gap when it could have worked. It's just like a very minor human error. But if you put something next to the gap to remind you, like for example, if I'm making a project that's all blue dominoes, I could put a bright pink domino next to it to remind me, oh, there's like a gap that I need to fill in. You can even leave the stack of dominoes that you need to fill in next to that little marker. You know, it doesn't even need to be a pink domino if you think that'll blend in. Like you could put like a roll of tape this is your reminder that you need to fill in a gap. It could literally be anything. Like you could put a lens cap here and be like, that lens cap doesn't belong in the setup. Oh, that's my reminder to fill in the safety gap. Number 6, make a list of all the safety gaps that you need to fill in before you knock it down, and try to make that a habit. This might be the most important one that most people, I think, do not do, myself included. I will just admit that. So like literally, I could take like a sticky note or a piece of paper and write down, okay, all right, so the first safety gap we have is green domino between blue. All right, so we have an actual physical piece of paper with a list of all of the safety gaps that we need, and before we knock it down, like literally cross it off, and then you'll be guaranteed to know that your entire setup will work. We tend to do this at much larger domino events just because there's much higher stakes. For my personal projects, I should probably do that more often too. With dominoes, I feel like it's just better to be safe than sorry, so if you are able to implement that in your whole process before you knock down dominoes, you will really thank yourself later and prevent so many silly just facepalm moments. Number 7, fill in the safety gaps as you build, because sometimes if you're making a larger project, if you have safety gaps that are further in the back, you're not really going to be able to reach those dominoes unless you actually crawl into the setup, which can be very risky, of course, because you don't want to be bumping anything in the setup at that point. So just keep an eye on your setup, you know, maybe even set an alarm every hour or two to just check, like, okay, am I going to be able to reach this safety gap later on when I finish? And if you can't fill it in and it's not easy to fill in at that point, fill it in now before it gets too late. As I'm finishing up my own domino projects, I'll tend to leave the easy safety gaps on the outside of it so that I can still reach it, but things that are further back or in the middle or are just going to be like really hard to reach, I'll make sure those are filled in as I'm building the dominoes. Number 8, determine which safety gaps that you actually need to set up at the very last minute. Now for some tricks, it's actually better to fill in the safety gap at the very last minute. For example, if I made a domino launcher with a rubber band, I may choose to set that up at the very last minute because if this rubber band is stretched for like a week straight, it might lose its elasticity and may not be as powerful. So knowing that, okay, I need to fill in this rubber band safety gap at the very last minute, make sure you actually have space to get to that in the setup. So it may be useful to make that trick on the border of the setup rather than in the middle of the setup so you can reach it better, but just plan accordingly to see if there's any tricks like that that need last minute safety gap filling in. Number 9, if necessary, purposely leave room in your setup to stand in it to fill in the safety gap later. There are tons of times where I'll purposely like make a line that's like the size of my foot so I can step into the setup in that open space and fill in safety gaps. I know it's gonna like depend on what your project looks like, but if you're thinking ahead about filling in the safety gaps and you make that room, it's going to be so much easier to fill it in and prevent failures. If you've already built the setup, what you also can do is take out dominoes in your setup to fit your foot in, to fill in the dominoes, or like fit your hand in to lean on the floor, and then fill that in again. So it's like you're making a safety gap for a safety gap. It's confusing, but if you need to reach into the setup, that can be helpful. And number 10, my final tip is instead of making a safety gap as an alternative, you can make a safety gap using tape. So this is pretty easy. We're gonna just make a one-way domino. We're gonna take a piece of tape, this is like 2 centimeters or 1 inch thick, and put half of it on the domino like this. And now we're gonna place the domino in the direction that the domino line is going to fall. And this is crucial because if you place this taped domino in the wrong direction, it will stop and your setup won't work. I feel like this is the equivalent of forgetting to fill in a safety gap. It's sort of like a facepalm moment, but like triple check the direction that you're placing this taped domino. So let's say I want to start this line from this direction. We want our safety gap to also fall in that direction, like so. I'm gonna put another taped domino right next to it, just because I think one domino can be a little risky to trust. So just in case, we have 2 taped dominoes right next to each other. And again, this is still going in the direction of the dominoes toppling. So when you finish your setup, it looks like there's no gap, right? You can't see any gap because the dominoes are taped down. This is only a one-way safety gap though. If you knock it down in the proper direction, it'll still knock down all the way. But if I knock it down from the opposite direction, for example like this, you'll see that the taped domino saves it. And this type of safety gap can be very useful if you don't want to see actual gaps in your project, or if you can't reach the safety gap later and you just want like something there to like hold your peace of mind knowing that it can't knock down in that opposite direction. We used this method a lot when making the domino circle field world record previously. I think every 20 rows or so, we actually made a whole ring of these one-way taped dominoes to act like a safety gap. So as we built that circle field from the center to the outside, if someone knocked down a domino, it would only knock down like 20 rows at a time, which was super helpful and prevented, I'm sure, a lot of big fails. Now, if you have any other safety gap tricks, tips, or hacks that I haven't mentioned, please let me know and the rest of the community know it down in the comments. I love getting the community together to like compile domino knowledge. I feel like we all learn from it and can be super helpful just reading what other people do. Also, all of my merch is currently 20% off until November 30th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. So go check it out. It includes all of my H5 shirts, Domino Artist shirts. We got signed dominoes, posters, postcards, stickers, all that stuff. Just go to hevish5.com/store and get 20% off just in time for the holidays. H5 Domino creations are also in stock for the holidays, but pricing may vary depending on where you buy it, so just check all the retailers at hevish5.com/buydominoes. Our featured community member is Extreme Domino. Thank you for leaving this comment. It was super relatable and I really appreciate it. As always, I'm Lily Hevish, and keep on building.